Welcome everyone to the webinar on the National Academy of Education Spencer Dissertation Fellowship. Our speakers today from the National Academy of Education are myself, Maria Gann, the Director of Professional Development Programs, as well as Angie Harmon, who is our Program Officer. We're also joined today by Dr. Sean Corcoran, who is a member of the Dissertation Selection Committee and an Associate Professor of Public Policy and Education at Vanderbilt University. If you have any technical difficulties with this webinar, please contact Zoom Technical Support at 1-888-799-9666 and choose option 2. You can see the number there on the slide. As an overview of the webinar, we will discuss what to do if you experience technical difficulties with the presentation. We'll provide a background on the Dissertation Fellowship, and we'll go over the application portal that you'll use to submit your application. The section on writing for your audience will be presented by Dr. Sean Corcoran. Finally, the last portion of the webinar will be used to answer your questions. And the webinar is scheduled for 1 hour and will be concluding by 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Just a few quick things before we get started. The audio for today's event will be streamed through your computer speakers. We will be taking questions through the Q&A box, which is located in the lower right-hand side of your screen. To ask a question, simply type it into the box and click Send. Please wait until the end of the online application portal section to ask any questions you have regarding the background of the fellowship or the portal itself, as your question may be answered during the presentation. Likewise, please wait until after Dr. Corcoran's presentation for any questions on your narrative or writing to your audience. The webinar is being recorded. Please understand that any questions you submit may be read aloud and included in a recording. A link to the recording, as well as a copy of the slides, will be posted on our website sometime next week. Once again, if you have any technical issues during the event, please contact Zoom Technical Support at 1-888-799-9666 and choose option 2. Now that the technical information is completed, I'd like to once again welcome you. Hopefully you are here to learn more about the NAEdSpencer Dissertation Fellowship Program. While our target audience is potential applicants, we may have deans, department heads, and other faculty signed on as well. Please know that if you're interested in the NAEdSpencer Postdoc Fellowship Program, we will host a separate webinar on that program in 2 weeks on September 18th, and you can register for that on our website. The NAEdSpencer Dissertation Fellowship is funded by the Spencer Foundation through a grant made to the National Academy of Education. The selection committee, comprised of NAEd members and other education scholars, will name 35 fellows at the end of this application cycle. The fellowship is intended to be a capstone to the fellow's dissertation writing experience. The fellowship term should therefore coincide with the final writing and defense of your dissertation. This is a screenshot of the fellowship application portal. The easiest way to get here is by visiting our website, www.naeducation.org, and following the links from the Dissertation Fellowship page. Depending on what web browser you are using, the portal may appear slightly different, but it should look very similar to this.
Please keep in mind our eligibility requirements for this award. Essentially, you should be ABD by the time the fellowship period begins on June 1st, 2020. You do not have to be a U.S. citizen, but you must be enrolled in a doctoral program at a U.S. institution of higher education. We hope that by the time you submit your application, you will have an idea of the timeline for your dissertation writing and revising, and will have completed data collection and conducted an initial analysis by June 1st, 2020. Note that you still may be eligible to apply if you do not expect to have your data finalized by that time. However, please be prepared to clearly articulate how and when your data will be collected. and how this will not impede finalizing your dissertation by the end of the grant period. If you experience any difficulties with the online application or something doesn't look right with the portal, please contact NAED staff for assistance. It is very important that you make sure you are applying for the correct program. Once you create a login, you will be directed to a page to choose the fellowship program. Make sure the name of the application you select is Dissertation Fellowship. If you are a previous applicant, you need to make sure you start a new application and not try and resubmit a previous one, as these will not be assessed. The application due date is October 3rd, and the submission, including your references, must be received by 5 p.m. Eastern Time. This is a hard date and time. No submissions will be accepted after the deadline, and no edits or additions to your applications will be made on your behalf by NAED staff. A few more notes on the application portal. Please complete all required fields to submit your application. We also ask that you upload all documents in PDF form and make sure that the PDF is not locked. This not only minimizes errors and difficulties for us down the line, but also streamlines your application review. For instance, sometimes transcripts are uploaded that can only be opened by the student or institution, or others will be permanently locked after a certain amount of time. So please do check to make sure that none of these securities are in place with the PDF you upload. It is very important, and we highly suggest you talk to your reference writers well in advance of preparing an application. You want to give them plenty of time to write a strong letter of recommendation as the selection committee reviews these submissions critically. Remember, they have the same deadline you do. The application portal will send an automated email when you input the names of your referees with instructions and a link to upload their letters. Applicants will receive a confirmation email when a reference submits their letter. Throughout the selection process, we will provide written updates via email. It is therefore very important that all email addresses you input are correct. Finally, to close out the overview of the application, 2 pieces of advice. All application components, including the letters of recommendation, are due on October 3rd, 2019 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. However, we suggest submitting your application ahead of time. Additionally, since we are a small staff, we typically have a difficult time trying to keep up with all the applicants and recommendation writers who try contacting us on the due date. Please plan accordingly and have any questions addressed before the application deadline. With the application overview completed, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Corcoran, who will talk more about your narrative and your audience. Dr. Corcoran?
Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone that's listening in to the webcast. So as was mentioned at the start of the presentation, my name is Sean Corcoran, and I'm a professor at Vanderbilt University. I've been on the dissertation selection committee for 3 years, I think, going on 4. And I'm here to offer you some information and advice about the contents of your application, and hopefully offer you some good suggestions on what separates a successful proposal from a less successful one. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is who your audience is for this proposal. The Dissertation Selection Committee is a diverse group of academics, all doing research on education in some area, but it's a very diverse group with diverse use of methodologies and analytic approaches. So your proposal should be written to a relatively broad audience. The initial readers of your proposal, which there are 2, will be closer to your own discipline. My background, for example, is in economics. I read a lot of economics and quantitatively focused proposals in the first round. But as the proposal moves on through the process, a more and more diverse group, and ultimately the full committee, will be looking at your narrative and proposal. So be sure that your narrative appeals to a diverse audience. And part of this is avoiding jargon. So all of us have our own disciplinary jargon. this can really get in the way if a reader is not familiar with those terms. So do write in a way such that anyone in other fields can understand what it is you're doing and why it's important. Can we, I don't think I can advance the slide. There we go. There are three criteria in mind that the committee are evaluating as they're reading your proposal. Number one is the importance of your research to education. So this should be a broadly important topic, again, that will appeal to academics across disciplines. Second is the quality and the feasibility of the project. And then lastly is sort of your own expected contribution to education research in the future. Again, using myself as an example, I was trained as an economist, did a dissertation in a topic of education. It was unusual at the time, I guess, to have a career in doing education research. And so if you're coming from a non-education school background like me, you want to make it very clear that this is a likely direction for your work in the future, regardless of where you may end up. And there are many ways in which you can communicate this in your application. For example, your letters of recommendation can speak to all three of these criteria mentioned on the slide. Your own personal statement, this is an important part of the application. You can mention your career goals, your interests, sort of what brought you to the topic that you're studying, and what you see yourself doing in the future. There we go. A little more details on each of these criteria. So in terms of the importance of research, so here what we're looking for is what is at stake research-wise? How will our understanding differ based on the outcomes of your research? How will the work that you're doing change what we think about the field of education and potential policies? How specifically would you expect what you learn to impact education for the better? In terms of evaluating the quality of the research, we need to know your overall approach, why that approach is appropriate for the research question. And also, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to make sure that your research questions are crystal clear. Often in a lot of proposals I've read, the specific research questions to be addressed are buried deeply in the proposal. You really want to make those questions front and center so that they're immediately clear to the reviewer. You should provide specifics of your data collection and analysis so that it's clear how your research questions are being addressed. But again, you want to strike a balance between providing too much technical detail that might be lost or maybe less important to some reviewers. And if there are limitations to your approach, be upfront about those and discuss them and how you're looking to move beyond those limitations. There's also just a fundamental evaluation of the quality of the applicant and whether you as an applicant show promise and motivation to contribute to education research in the long term. And again, it does not mean that you intend to move to a school of education in the future. You may work in a disciplinary department or any number of different settings. But this fellowship is to fund future education researchers, and that should come clear in your application. Here are a few more tips, and I have a few more, I think, beyond this list. As part of your application, you're going to be including a timeline of your dissertation work. This will be looked at in detail. You want to make it clear that you've made significant progress on your dissertation so that the project, so what you have remaining is feasible. But make sure it doesn't look like you've already completed your project. I've read a number of really high-quality proposals that essentially sound like they're 100% completed, and it's unclear what the fellowship is funding. So strike a balance between demonstrating progress, but work to come. Many applicants, including those from my field of economics, will have multi-paper dissertations, which often are loosely connected, if connected at all. I'm comfortable with these types of proposals, but committee members from other fields are maybe less familiar with this style of dissertation. And so my recommendation here is to focus perhaps on one of the papers, maybe mention that your dissertation consists of 3 papers, but focus in on the central paper, or perhaps the one that the fellowship is likely to support the ongoing work. Another issue with narratives around multi-paper dissertations is that you don't have much space to devote to each of those 3 papers, and so the proposal may feel inadequate if that's the case. The quality of your writing is extremely important, so I strongly recommend that you get feedback from your peers, from advisors, and especially reviewers in other fields. So if you can find someone outside of your discipline to read the proposal and see if it makes sense to them, if it's compelling to them, that will go a long way. And again, there should be a coherent narrative here, something that makes sense to everyone who reads it. I would add to this to avoid just copying and pasting from your own dissertation proposal. I do see a lot of narratives that look like they've been cut from the original proposal, and they're written to sort of an audience of advisors and not a fellowship dissertation selection committee. So it pays to start from scratch and write an original, solid, coherent narrative for this proposal. Lastly here, make sure that your advisor has a detailed knowledge of your project. One would think that advisors would be intimately aware of what it is you're proposing to do, but I have seen examples of disconnect between letters of recommendation and the applicant's proposal. So make sure that you're on the same page. These recommendation letters are weighted very heavily and read closely. Important piece of advice there. In terms of appendices, you're welcome to include those, but they can be distracting. The selection committee is not required to read appendices. We have a lot of reading to do across all the submitted applications, so be judicious in including those. Really, the narrative should include all that's needed to evaluate your proposal. And any information that you provide in the appendix should be elaborating or providing maybe examples of empirical work that have already been done to support the proposal. Anything that's, again, central to the narrative should be discussed in the body of the application. Let me see if I have any other useful tips here. One other item here. So there are some graduate students that work as part of a large team or a lab. If that is the situation for you, make sure you're clear in your application what your unique contribution is to the larger project. I know that's a model that's increasingly used in education research, and for the reviewer, it can sometimes be difficult to identify what the graduate student is contributing originally to the project. So if you're in that circumstance, be sure to give attention to your own unique role in that project. So to summarize what you've heard so far, start early, know your audience, tell them everything that they need to know.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Corcoran. We're now going to turn to our Q&A period. So if you have any questions, please type them into the box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have questions that are very specific to your application, or if we don't have time to get to your question, you can send us a follow-up email. You'll see the email address here on the slide, info@naeducation.org. Otherwise, we will go ahead and get started. So we have a question here about the budget, so the way that you'll use the funds if you're selected as a fellow, and whether or not you need to submit a budget with your application. So you don't have to submit a budget as part of the application, but if you're chosen as a semifinalist, which you would be notified of in early March of 2020, then we ask you for an application update at that time, because we recognize that things might have changed in your timeline since you applied, and you may have made some progress on the work during that time period. So you'll submit sort of a narrative update, and then you'll also submit a budget that shows how you plan to spend the funds.
All right, and we were also asked whether awarded funds can be used for travel to the writing workshop or retreats. So this is not part of your budget. We have budgeted to move all of the finalists to the retreats. This is not going to come out of your budget, so you don't need to worry about that. And then another question was, if awarded, will there be a program officer to coordinate with if there are changes to the proposed research, such as data sharing agreements that can't be secured for the proposed data? So I am your program officer, and we will not require that you confirm all of these changes with us, but we do want to be informed about big changes in your project. And so just keep us updated, and generally we can work with these changes.
We have a couple questions about the timeline of the actual fellowship itself. So the fellowship does need to be at least 9 months in length and cannot be longer than 24 months, though most fellows will conduct the fellowship during one academic year, so during 9 months. Rarely we've had occasions where fellows will spread that out longer, but it cannot go longer than 24 months. And someone also asked if they're planning to graduate in the summer of 2020, are they eligible? So you wouldn't be eligible unless you're willing to push back your graduation date, because the earliest you can start the fellowship is June of 2020. So you would start in June, and then the earliest you could finish would be in the spring of 2021. I saw a question here that Dr. Corcoran, if you don't mind answering, it's, let me just find it here. So it was referring to those who have a multi-paper dissertation proposal. The applicant is asking, how do we avoid communicating one study such that it seems too narrow or insufficient? They're worried that a reviewer looking at just one study would feel that it was an insufficient dissertation if they only focus on one paper out of the multiple papers they're writing for their dissertation.
Yeah, in cases like that, and in all cases really with multi-paper dissertations, I wouldn't recommend leaving out 2 of the papers and focusing entirely on one. You know, especially if the papers are conceptually linked, I think it's worth devoting time in your application talking about what's been completed on those projects and how they connect to the one that's currently in progress, so that it's seen as part of a larger research agenda. I haven't found that proposals that like that have been seen as insufficient.
Great, thank you.
All right, so we had another question, whether the applicants need to have collected all the data before applying. So it is preferred that you have finished your data collection and a preliminary analysis before you apply. If you're not able to do that, you can submit a timeline that will explain how you will get this done in a timely manner before you actually begin your fellowship.
So Dr. Corcoran, I have another question for you actually. So someone's asking, how much detail is useful to be included in the timeline that they submit?
That is a tough one, because I know different members of the committee devote different amounts of time to looking at the timeline. I think I would repeat what I said earlier, which is, provide enough detail that it's clear what's been accomplished so far, and sort of what that what specific steps are involved next, and have a realistic timeline. My personal opinion on these is I don't like them to be overly detailed.
Great, thank you. So someone's asking,
I guess I would also add, don't be insufficiently detailed either. So
right.
A timeline that says data collection, writing, is probably not detailed enough.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you. Someone's asking if I have 2 dissertation co-chairs, may they co-write one letter of recommendation? Yes, that's perfectly fine. And in fact, I'd recommend you do that so that you don't waste your second letter, so to speak. Okay, let's see. How many people apply each year for the fellowship? So we generally get between 400 and 420 applications each year for 35 slots. And we'll, as I mentioned before, we have 2 stages of the review process before we determine who will be the semifinalists. And the selection committee will choose 60 semifinalists. And you'll find out if you are a semifinalist in March of 2020. And then the semifinalists will be notified in May of 2020 as to whether or not they've been ultimately selected.
We were asked if there were any examples of successful applications that could be available for you to review and learn. I'm sorry, but we are not able to make previous applications available. On our link, however, on the FAQ, there's a link to The Art of Writing Proposals, which we strongly encourage you to read.
So
I think reading the bios of prior fellows would help as well.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And we do, I would encourage people to reach out to current and former fellows. We don't provide, obviously, their contact information for privacy reasons, but in my experience, they're often very happy to speak with applicants. We also have a question here, and one that I receive pretty often. There's a question in the application about essentially how this study is going to impact the field. So the first part of the question is, scholars now believe ... and the second part is, as a result of my study ... And people often ask me for clarification. So essentially what we're wanting to see here is, in the first part of the question, how do you feel the field currently thinks of the topic area you're investigating, whether that be maybe there's some pitfalls or lack of evidence there. And then the second part is, how is your study going to help fill that gap or add to the knowledge, add to the literature that already exists. And you don't need to be, we understand that you may feel like your study is not going to be impactful beyond your discipline, but we do want to see how you're envisioning it and your future research agenda to be impactful on the field of education writ large. Mm-hmm. If you have any more questions about that, I'm happy to chat with you.
All right, and we were asked, can the fellowship just be used for living expenses and paying for tuition? Yes, this is fine. You can use this fellowship for anything that you might need for living expenses. You can use it for medical insurance. You can use this for travel you might need for your project. It's fairly broad what you can spend the money on.
Dr. Corcoran, a question for you. Someone is asking, how much should I go into detail about the preliminary results of my study in the project statement?
Preliminary results. I find those actually very useful, as again, as long as they don't give the impression that the work is already complete. So I highly recommend including preliminary results for those applicants who have them. But only use them as sort of a launching point into sort of what comes next.
Great. Someone's asking, is there a preference for applicants that would take a 9-month fellowship versus a 24? No, there's no preference for us. It's really just about what works best for you, your institution, and does it make sense, the timeline you're proposing to do. Let's see here. So someone is asking if I don't finish collecting my data until June of 2021, am I eligible this cycle? So no, in that case, you'd want to wait till next year to apply, because as Angie mentioned, the data collection does need to be done by the time you start the fellowship. And for this current cycle, most fellows will start in the summer of 2020, We can be flexible and let you start as late as January of 2021, but that's really the latest that you could start. So if you need to start in the summer of 2021, you should wait till next year to apply.
We were asked whether the 9-month period can start in September 2020. Yes, that's possible.
Someone is asking, should the participant have defended their proposal before applying? So that, not necessarily, depending on your timeline. If you have an anticipated defense date, I would put that on, or approval date, I would put that on your application. But we understand that you might not have that approved until between the time you apply and the time you start the fellowship.
I would say in cases like that, that the recommendation letter from the advisor should sort of speak to their support of the work.
All right, so we had another question that was, I've had extensive experience in a research project as part of my doctoral experience. Can my project supervisor, who's not a faculty member, provide a recommendation? Yes, that would be fine, especially since they know your work really well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, another question was, would my application be hurt if I'm currently transitioning institutions or departments? The research topic remains in education. We have had fellows do this in the past. It is not a significant issue. It will not impact your application. You just need to keep us informed.
So a question that might be well suited for Dr. Corcoran. So someone's asking about proposing a mixed method study. Part of their question is that acceptable for the fellowship, and it most certainly is. But I would pose to you, Dr. Corcoran, the question, how do you recommend people who are conducting a mixed method study to leave enough space in the methodology section of their project statement to really flesh out the methods without taking up too much space?
Yeah, I think that's a longer conversation. Although in general, I think mixed methods approaches are very appealing to the committee. They also do run the risk of not sort of giving enough attention to either of the methodologies. I'm not sure that that one needs to give full treatment to the quantitative methods and the qualitative methods that will be used, but certainly enough to satisfy the committee, and I think more importantly, showing how those two work together and why they're both needed in that particular project.
All right, so we had someone with a technical question regarding listing their presentations and publications in the online application. They're asking whether there's a particular format you should use, APA, MLA. So we do not have a particular format that you need to use because our fellows come from all different fields. Just make sure that you choose one and are consistent with it.
Someone's asking if it's acceptable to have other sources of funding during the fellowship period. So this can kind of be a case-to-case basis. Essentially, we don't allow you to take other funding if its purpose is the same as our fellowship. So if you have like a dissertation completion fellowship from your institution, for example, or another large grant similar to ours, we wouldn't allow you to have both. But if it's something like you have a small fellowship from your department, or if you're TAing perhaps and you're getting some stipend money from that, that's fine. As long as your outside employment doesn't exceed 15 hours a week, that's perfectly fine. But essentially what happens if you're selected is we'll ask you, please let us know of any funding you've received since you applied, and we can figure out how to best navigate that. So we have another question that's specifically about people who are in the helping professions, so that includes counseling and clinical and school psychology. It says that these scholars are required to complete an internship as the last component of their program. How are applicants from these fields' eligibility for this fellowship impacted if they're completing the fellowship at the same time? It's completely fine to have that internship ongoing during your fellowship period. It's ideal that the internship doesn't exceed 15 hours a week, like I mentioned. So in your case, I think we would work with you to figure out the best timeline. Because if it's a full-time internship, we really wouldn't want that to be coinciding with your fellowship period. So I wouldn't worry about this at this moment. You're still eligible to apply, and we could work the details out if you're selected and make sure that you're able to do both.
All right, so we had another question that was, am I ineligible to apply if my chair is currently on parental leave and unable to provide a letter of recommendation by the deadline? So I would just try to find somebody else maybe on your committee that could write a letter, but certainly we can work around this.
Another question about letters of recommendation. Do the letters need to be both from faculty at the university that you attend, or could one come from a faculty member somewhere else? And do they both need to be full-time faculty, or can they be adjuncts? Really, our only stipulation about letters of recommendation is that one come from your advisor, but we recommend that regardless of who the second person is, they be someone who knows your work well and understands the fellowship parameters and the purpose of it. Because if you're, for example, coming from a discipline outside of education, you want someone who can really articulate your skills as an education researcher and the importance of the project you're proposing to do. So it's fine if they're an adjunct faculty, and it's perfectly fine if they're at a different institution. But I would just make sure you're choosing two people who really do know you well, including your advisor as one of those people.
That's great advice.
Dr. Corcoran, another question I would pose to you. Someone is wondering how much do the publications and grants count for reviewers? I think we get this question kind of a lot from dissertation applicants because some of them may not have very extensive publication lists, especially depending on the field that they're coming from.
Yeah, so I think those kinds of experiences, prior publications, presentations, grants, those can be positive for an applicant, and they certainly help provide a narrative or provide some evidence of the track that you're on and the kinds of work that you do. That being said, I don't think it's not a negative for an applicant to not have prior publications or grants. We certainly understand that varies a lot by discipline.
Great, thank you.
All right, another question was, has the fellowship ever funded dissertations in history in which the value for education policy is not immediately clear, but that contribute to the field of the history of education? Yes, we have, and I strongly encourage you to look at the bios of our fellows on the website. You'll see that there are certainly fellows who are doing this sort of work. Another question was, if you take a 24-month timeline, is the money dispersed differently? So you will receive the first disbursement as soon as your fellowship starts, just like a regular one-year fellow. However, you will receive your second disbursement halfway through your fellowship. So that will mean about a year in.
Great. Let's see. So if we're awarded the fellowship but don't complete the dissertation by the expected date, what are the ramifications? So we understand that, circumstances do change. I would say most of our fellows follow the timeline. June they start, and then they complete their fellowship in the spring and graduate in May of the next year. And that's not a hard and fast rule. You may start in June but not graduate until the fall of the following year. Essentially, you need to complete your dissertation within 2 years of the fellowship starting. But we understand that sometimes the timeline can change, and we can work with you. There's no serious ramifications for that.
So we asked if we could have the contact information of the grant officer. So I'm your program officer, Angie Harmon, and one of the best ways to get in touch with me is through email. That's aharmon, AHARMON, @naeducation.org. .ed.org.
Dr. Corcoran, a question for you. Does the committee find it discouraging if an applicant uses already collected data towards the proposal, or data that the applicant is not collecting, in other words?
No, there's lots of successful applications that use secondary data. Whether that's like large-scale administrative data from a state or one of the National Center for Education Statistics databases. That's certainly not a negative.
So we were asked if we could clarify more about the start date. It sounded like we have to start in June 2021, but completion can vary. It sounds like the start date can also vary. So it is possible to vary the start dates of your fellowship. This was simply the earliest it could start was June. Fellows will start at a range of dates, including June or September. Let us know what you need, and we can generally work with you.
Dr. Corcoran, a question for you. What tends to stand out for you in recommendation letters?
Recommendation letters. I think a letter writer that really knows the student, the applicant, sort of can't just speak to the research idea, but also to the person, sort of what motivates them, what their likely trajectory is, the originality of their work. Those kinds of things make the biggest impression to me. It's usually pretty clear when the advisor is very disconnected from the student and the work.
Great. We had a couple questions asking if projects focused on countries other than the United States are assessed with the same interest, and they certainly are. The NAED and Spencer are really interested in diversity and diversity in many ways, so not just diversity in terms of ethnicity and home institution, but also diversity in terms of discipline and methodology, and also your geographic focus area. So we want a mix of applications and a mix of fellows who focus on the U.S. and other countries. And you'll see in our list of current fellows, there is a really wide range of that there, and we find that to be very valuable. So certainly we encourage you to apply, but you do need to be based at a U.S. institution. As we mentioned before, you don't have to be a U.S. citizen, but if you're based at an institution outside the United States, you're not eligible for this program. But in that case, I would encourage you to apply for our postdoc fellowship. You'll be eligible for that once you finish your PhD, so certainly keep an eye out for that program.
Right. And we asked, is it okay if I'm not ABD when I apply for the fellowship, but I will be ABD or have conducted data collection before the fellowship year starts? So it is preferred if you are ABD and have completed the data collection and a preliminary analysis before you apply. But as we said before, if that's not possible, make sure you include a clear timeline for how you can do that before the fellowship would begin.
Someone's asking, of the 35 selected fellows, is there a limit on how many can come from a particular discipline? So I would say, there's not a specific limit, but the selection committee is advised to make sure that the fellow cohort is diverse in discipline. Of course, we can't control the number of applications we receive from each discipline every year or the quality of the applications. So some years there may be more fellows in one discipline over another, but the selection committee is really careful to ensure that there is diversity in the cohort, because we feel that you forming relationships with your colleagues in the cohort is one of the really valuable parts of the fellowship, so we want you to get a lot out from that experience as well. Here's an interesting question for Dr. Corcoran. What are the three most important aspects of the application and why? That's a tough one.
Whoa, that is a tough one.
If you want to take
Let's see how I can do. I would say originality originality and creativity is a really important criteria. I would say a clear relevance, and broad applicability, as I mentioned earlier. So there are some topics that are just Byzantine that seem like they're of interest maybe to two people within the field, and I think even those topics can be sold in such a way that that those outside the field can really see what the utility of the work is. And then, it's been said many times, but I think the fit to the fellowship and whether the fellow really will pursue a career doing education-focused work.
Great, thank you very much. Someone's asking about the timeline. Should the timeline start at the fellowship start date? You could actually include information about the time before the fellowship start date, and I think that is helpful to do, so that in the year before, essentially that you have a whole academic year between the time you apply and the time you start, so it would be helpful to see what you plan to do during that period, and then leading into the fellowship start date. And then if you are a semifinalist, like I mentioned, we'll ask you for an update to see how much progress you've made on the activities you're planning to do, and if you've changed your timeline for the fellowship period at all. So we have an interesting question here about if someone has a methodology that's arts-based, can they include a photo or a slide or other multimedia like that in their application? I would say that would be an appropriate thing to include in the appendix. And then, in the narrative itself, you can really make clear what these documents are referring to, why they're important to your project. I think, as Sean mentioned, the appendix, obviously you don't want to put anything in there that's essential that you really need the narrative or the reviewers to look through, but I think this would be an appropriate thing for an appendix.
Absolutely. Multimedia probably wouldn't work, right, if it were video?
Right. You could include a link to a video, but that is a little bit clunkier. I think it's easier to have something that's visual like that. Let's see. So another question to do with international projects. They're asking for any tips or general feedback for applicants whose work focuses on another country. Dr. Corcoran, I don't know if you want to address that one.
Yeah, this comes up a lot. There are a lot of proposals with work in other countries, and I would say that in my experience, there's sort of two things that come up with these applications. One is that the proposal seems so highly specific to that country or context. Sometimes it's a historical project in another country, that the proposal really needs to do more work to make the study relevant to other places and time periods. So that's something I see a lot. The opposite problem, I think, is there's some that are doing international work where the context really doesn't matter at all to them. Maybe they're doing a randomized control trial, and I think the committee can also view those proposals as maybe insufficiently giving enough attention to the particular context. So, broad applicability is important, but if you're doing international work, I think also be very clear as to why the work is being conducted in that location.
Great, thank you. I actually have another one I'd love your input on. Someone's asking whether reviewers prioritize research implications versus policy implications when they're looking at applicants' work, and the way that they describe the intended impact of the project.
I'm not sure one is preferred over the other. Generally speaking, I think policy implications resonate with a broader variety of reviewers, because it would speak to maybe their general interest in education policy, but I wouldn't say that one is given more attention than the other.
All right, we had another question about whether, about someone saying that they're an older PhD student with a lengthy career in education is at a disadvantage. And I would say strongly, this is not a disadvantage. Having experience in the field is helpful. And additionally, we welcome all types of diversity, and that includes age diversity.
So someone is asking, regarding appendices, would a survey or assessment instrument be an appropriate document to include? Yes, I would say that would be appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
What disciplines do you receive the most applications from? This is a good question, and it does really change year to year. It's interesting actually to see the trends and how they shift. I mean, obviously we do get a lot of applications from people specifically in education, but I think it's probably about 50-50 education versus disciplines. And by disciplines, I just mean someone outside the field of education looking at an education issue. I think we get a good number of history proposals, actually, and a good number of high-quality history proposals. That's the field that sort of stands out to me as one that is often very popular in terms of how many people apply. But again, we're evaluating these applications with diversity in mind always. It's really important to us. So don't be discouraged to apply if you feel like your discipline is sort of unusual in the cohort you've seen on our website. It's really more it comes down to the quality of the application and also how you connect your discipline to education, and also make it clear that you're planning a career in education research. So we do sometimes see people apply for whom this is their first education project and potentially don't see much of a future in education research for that person, or they haven't made it clear that that's their goal. So that's something that I think the reviewers take very seriously as well.
Definitely, and I would just reiterate what you said before about doing something a little bit different than the norm is not a disadvantage in any way. There are so many good, high-quality applications that applicants that are, in an underrepresented field or are doing something creative or quite different than the norm, those tend to stand out in a pretty positive way.
Someone's asking if there's a preference for PhD students who are in years 5 or 6 of the program versus years 3 or 4, so long as data collection is finished by the start of the fellowship. So no, we don't have a preference, and as long as your timeline fits ours, essentially, and our parameters, that's perfectly fine. Let's see here. So someone is asking if my dissertation advisor has changed, how can I handle this? Specifically, how might I compensate for an advisor who knows my work but doesn't necessarily have an intimate knowledge of who I am as a student? That's an interesting situation. I would probably recommend that your current advisor write the letter, but it would be helpful maybe to have that person consult with your former advisor, the person who knows you as a student well, simply because it is important to get sort of a holistic idea of who you are. And we understand that this happens, so we don't want you to be punished for it, but I think that would be a good approach. Are applicants encouraged to reapply if they don't succeed in being awarded the fellowship? You're certainly welcome to reapply if you're able to do so. I think a lot of our dissertation applicants are not able to reapply simply because they've graduated by the time the application opens again. But if you do reapply, I would just let you be aware of the fact that our selection committee will see that you're a reapplicant. They'll probably recognize your application from the year before. So they will want to know how have you improved the application, or have you made significant changes to it. And you can certainly apply with the same project, but it's worth reviewing it carefully, improving it where you think you might be able to before you submit it again.
Yeah, definitely don't submit the same exact application twice.
Right. What's the latest start date we could have? Essentially, we can be as flexible as possible up until January of 2021. That's really the last start date. If you need to start after January of 2021, you should apply next year, not this year. If you're not selected as a fellow, will you receive any feedback on your application? Unfortunately, due to the volume of the number of applications we get, we are not able to provide feedback. Let's see what other questions we have here. And I just want to mention again, we're going to be finishing up here in about 5 minutes, so if we're not able to get to your question, you can send it to us at the email on the screen. We'll also send a follow-up email to everyone who registered for the webinar so that you can be in touch with us if you want to talk on the phone or have an email conversation. Sometimes it's easier to do it via phone.
All right, so another question we got was whether dissertation and fellowship awardees later apply for the postdoctoral fellowship. Yes, and it's also possible to have a dissertation and fellowship and then later on also have a postdoctoral fellowship.
So this is an interesting question. Should we expect that the personal narrative be read after the proposal, or should it be able to completely stand alone? I want to reference something specific in my personal narrative, but I'm not sure what extent I need to re-explain what I'm discussing in the project narrative. I would say you don't necessarily need to re-explain. Simply because I think most of our reviewers read an application in one period of time, and so read the entire package at one time so they can get a full sense of the applicant, and recognize that we understand you don't have a lot of space. The project narrative is only 10 pages, so to the extent that you can, I would try to avoid restating anything that you don't feel you need to, just so that you can save the space. Someone had asked as well earlier about, in the personal statement, should I talk about the fact that I come from an underrepresented background or disadvantaged background and the challenges I've overcome as a result? Certainly, I mean, that's part of your story, that's part of your narrative. I think it's important to include information about why you've been inspired to work in the field of education and how your own background contributes to that and impacts your perspective as well. So certainly that's welcome. Sorry, just looking at more questions here.
As a reviewer, I can say I much prefer hearing someone's personal narrative and story and motivations and hopes and aspirations than I do a sort of generic personal statement about how education is important.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked, would we be required to write the dissertation on the university campus, or is it fine to finish it somewhere else? I mean, that's perfectly fine and up to you where you are physically, as long as, obviously you're meeting the requirements of the institution that you're at. So I know we do have some fellows who have moved from the city where their university is and just commute back and forth. So that's perfectly fine. Someone is asking, can the fellowship funding be used for tuition? And yes, it can. I think it's fairly common for our fellows institutions to waive their tuition fees during the fellowship period. And, we want your institution to support you in however much as possible. So I would just, if you are awarded the fellowship, thinking about ways you can negotiate that with your institution. If there are current fellows there or former fellows there, it's always helpful to talk to them to see how they handled that in the past and what the institution was able to do for them.
We were asked, is it okay for students who are researching text but are not really working with student-teacher participants to apply for the fellowship? And this is fine. I think a lot of the people in history are not working with student or teacher participants. and we have funded quite a few of those fellows. Remember that we interpret education very broadly, and we don't expect to see all of our fellows working in classrooms with students.
All right, well, it is now 3 o'clock, and in the interest of not keeping you late, we're going to go ahead and finish the webinar. If we didn't get to your question, like I said, please feel free to email us. The email address is up on the screen. It's info@naeducation.org, and either Angie or myself will be in touch with you. A copy of the recording of the webinar, as well as the slides, will be posted on our website within the next week. And we are very excited and looking forward to receiving your applications. I also just want to say thank you very much to Dr. Corcoran, who provided some very useful insights today. We appreciate your help, and thank you everyone for participating. Have a great day.
Thank you.